Good morning, Western Civ 2. So this is how we're going to have our lectures this week and who knows how much longer. Our topic today is the Cold War. How did we get to the Cold War? And what is its implications for the next 45 years of American history? So the term Cold War, off the start, Cold War is contrasted with hot war. A hot war is where you have, shooting between two rival armies. They actually are trying to kill each other and break each other's things in a hot war. A Cold War is one without the shooting. It's a war where they don't actually kill each other and destroy each other's possessions, but they're essentially on a war footing against each other. That's what a Cold War is. And the Cold War, capital C, capital W, Cold War, lasted from the very beginning of 1946 until arguably the spring of 1991. You might go a bit earlier. By December of 1989, Eastern Europe had fallen out of the Soviet Union's control. So some people might say 1989 is the end of the war, but I'll go to 91 because that's when the Soviet Union itself finally imploded. So the Cold War lasts from 1946 to 1991, and it refers to this period of war footing that the United States and our allies had against the Soviet Union and its allies or subservient states. More broadly, you could say it was a period of near warlike footing between capitalism and liberal democracy on our side and communism on the other side. Now, it begins in 1946. This is right after World War II. You'll remember that Nazi Germany surrendered in May of 1945 to the Allies. And Japan surrendered to us in September of 1945. During the war, we were allies with the Soviet Union. They were our gallant Russian comrades in the war against Nazi Germany. And we gave them enormous amounts of military equipment to help fight the Nazis. Some aircraft literally built right here in Hurst, Texas, flew in the Soviet Red Air Force against Nazi Germany in World War II. Most of the trucks, 90% of the trucks the Red Army was using at the end of World War II were made in the United States of America. That's an interesting stat. But things changed very rapidly. When World War II came to an end, it became clear to many people that the interests of the United States and Great Britain and most of Western Europe were diametrically opposed to what the Soviet Union considered its own interests in Europe. Now, the groundwork for this disagreement had been laid at the Yalta Conference. At the very beginning of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt had traveled to Yalta. That's a resort, in the Crimea. So if you look at a map of the Ukraine, there's a little peninsula sticks down almost like an island. There's just a little neck of land that connects this island-like body to the rest of Ukraine, and it hangs down into the Black Sea. So this is in the Soviet Union. Early in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt traveled all the way there, met Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier. The big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met there at the beginning of 1945. It was clear that sometime probably in the next year, the war in Europe would be over and Nazi Germany would be defeated. There was still a lot of killing to do, another 5 months of brutal fighting, and hundreds of thousands more would perish, but the writing was on the wall. Everybody knew Nazi Germany was going down. It was just a matter of time and destruction. So then the question is what to do about the future of Europe after the war against Nazi Germany is over. We had been allies, the British and the Americans on one side and the Soviets on the other. We'd been allies with each other against Nazi Germany could we cooperate on a future for Europe after the war? Yalta was designed to establish how that was going to work. Well, Eastern Europe was being liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Every day, another group of miles were captured back from the Nazis, and they were pushed back into Germany further. The Allies in the West, Britain and America, Canada, and Free French forces had landed at Normandy, as you'll remember, in June of 1944. By the end of 1944, we had liberated almost the whole of France and most of Belgium, pieces of Holland. And we're pushing into Germany from the west. So when the Yalta Conference is being held, only very, very small parts of West Germany had actually been occupied by Allied forces, and the Soviets hadn't quite gotten there in the east, but they're getting there. But meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army has occupied almost the whole of what was once Poland, most of what is Hungary. Czechoslovakia was rapidly coming under Red Army control. Portions of Austria. Romania was entirely in Red Army hands. Bulgaria, entirely in Red Army hands by the beginning of 1945. What's the future of these countries? Now, Hungary and Romania had been fascist dictatorships before the war. Nobody wanted to put their old governments back in place. They were willing allies of Adolf Hitler, so nobody wanted them back in charge of those countries, so some other form of government would have to be put in place in places that had been fascist. But you'll remember the British actually went to war in 1939 to preserve Poland. And yet the Soviet Red Army was in charge of most of Poland by the time the Yalta Conference was held. Would they be willing to have what were known as the London Poles, the government of Poland that had fled to London for the last 5 years? Would they want the London Poles running Poland? Or do they imagine something else for the future of Poland? Would the British accept a Soviet government that wasn't the one they went to war to defend in 1939? These are big questions. What about countries like Bulgaria? They hadn't been fascist, but in the end, they bowed to what they thought was necessity and technically allied themselves with Hitler before he invaded them. Again, they weren't hardcore fascists, but they didn't resist the Nazis. Do they get their government back? Yugoslavia? What about that? The king of Yugoslavia? What's to be his future? So you can see there were big questions about Eastern Europe in particular. Meanwhile, British troops had landed in Greece and were occupying Greece slowly but surely. So Eastern Europe is a real patchwork. Most of it is in the hands of the Russians, or the Soviets. A little bit of Greece was in the hands of the British. How will this part of the world look after the Germans are finally and utterly defeated, as they would be in May of 1945? Well, at Yalta, an agreement was reached. Temporarily, there were to be Allied councils of control. There were to be military governments by the Allies over the states of Eastern Europe. Poland and most of the states that the Soviets occupied were to be under 90% Soviet control, with the Western Allies having 10% of the Allied councils of control. In other words, if the Soviets have 90% of the say, what the Soviets want will be done. Now, this was supposed to be a temporary measure until democratic elections could be held. So these committees of control are going to set up governments, supposedly temporary, in each of the states of Eastern Europe until free and fair democratic elections could be held. But instead, the Soviets used their 90% control of most of these places to put in place socialist or downright communist politicians, people who had no positive connection with the Germans over the period of occupation. It was clear these were people who were going to be loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. So Poland wound up with a temporary government dominated by communists and socialists. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary was a mixed deal. I believe it was a 50-50 Council of Control. So it wasn't guaranteed that it was going to fall to the communists eventually. But in every state where the Soviets could put 90% of the people of their choice on these temporary governments, the result was there were never free and fair elections in those places. The elections were heavily rigged. The Soviets made sure that their loyalists in these new temporary governments controlled the army of that new country, that newly remade country, controlled the Interior Department, which would be in charge of like the state police. So the apparatus of control, where power lies in the government, was entirely in the hands of communists in these places. And they used it to ensure that whenever whatever they were claiming were going to be free and fair elections, the communists were going to win. So by 1947, communist governments were in place in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. Hungary, not quite done yet. By the end of 47, it will be a communist-controlled government. They had to literally stage a coup d'etat. And the same will be said in Czechoslovakia. There, the chance of real democracy was thwarted by a communist coup. They got control of the Interior Ministry and the military, and they were able to impose themselves. So that by the end of 1946, Winston Churchill could give a speech in Fulton, Missouri, at a college. He's the former Prime Minister of Britain by then. He'd been replaced in July of 1945 by Clement Attlee. But Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, would give a speech in the United States in which he would refer to an iron curtain descending across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic, that's up in the north on the coast of Poland, to Trieste on the Adriatic, that's down by Italy. So an iron curtain stretching down across Europe. He used this phrase, iron curtain, to indicate that the West, the United States, Britain, France now, which is back on its feet again as an ally, that we would have nothing to say about what went on behind that iron Soviet curtain in Eastern Europe. And increasingly, it was becoming clear that Stalin wasn't going to let people freely move back and forth across that iron curtain. So Eastern Europe, by 1946, was largely lost to the West and to democracy. And a Soviet state was put in place, Soviet-style state, in all those countries of Eastern Europe. Now, I haven't talked about Germany yet. But we're going to stop this video now so you can take a moment to process what I've just said about Eastern Europe and how it fell under Soviet hands in the 2 years right after World War II. And next time we come back, we'll talk about Germany, because that's a very complex and the pivotal issue that really leads to the Cold War. Thank you.